Coward. Leave coward. Leave coward. 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 Leave coward.
Sit up straight, children, because I'm your conservative substitute teacher, a scholar of Pig Latin and Gats and Flags, an adult who is always right, and let me tell you, there'll be no Lion King on VHS when I'm here. It's your conservative host, Ralph Wigglesworth, and this is Debate Me, Coward.
And I'm your neoliberal establishmentarian bad boy, a man who isn't afraid of serving a little hard time in detention for, I don't know, spray painting the Biden-Harris logo on my locker, maybe? That's right, it's Lenny Thompson yet again.
So today's show is all about socialist Sunday schools. Greg, can we get a clip of a suburban housewife screaming in horror there? Because you didn't mishear me. I said socialist Sunday schools.
That's right. Socialist Sunday school may sound like a dreamy fixture for a utopian future, but over a century ago, radical classrooms thrived across the U.S. and Great Britain.
Now, in just a moment, we'll speak with writer Erica X Eisen, who recently wrote an article about this topic for Current Affairs, titled The Past and Future of the Socialist Sunday School.
That's right, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show and follow us on Twitter at CowardCast. Now, on to the interview.
Remember, take notes, listeners, or we'll send you to the gulags. Joining us now is Erica X Eisen. She's a writer, editor, and journalist currently living in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, whose work frequently focuses on the intersection of the arts and broader social and political themes. Thank you for coming on the show, Erica.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're going to talk about your recent article for Current Affairs titled The Past and Future of the Socialist Sunday School. Now, this kind of hit me because I actually spent some time growing up in the opposite of this. I went to a capitalist summer camp. So we had a tug of war where all the poor kids would already be standing in the mud puddle, and we just kind of drag them further in. We made the camp next to ours, worked double time to make extra macaroni pictures so we could give to our families. We actually, we even absorbed, there was a smaller up-and-coming camp, and so we had those kids come over and start cleaning up our camp. Because it's like, why are those hippies just like running free over there? And we could help them get real jobs. And so that allowed us, the kids who were actually going to the camp, focus on more practical skills, like how to balance a Fortune 500's yearly income tax so that it comes out to zero, and how to yell at your staff without sounding racist. You know, practical skills that we would use when running companies later on. So tell us, what is a socialist Sunday school, and how is that different from my experience?
Well, I would say it's quite starkly different.
No tug of war?
No tug of war, no Fortune 500 balance sheets and whatnot. The socialist Sunday school movement began in the late 19th century in England. The first woman to found one of these schools was a woman named Mary Gray, and she had previously been a Christian Sunday school teacher. But she became quite disenchanted with religion and became a very active member of the labor movement. She became friends with Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, and so on. And as she was, attending to a strike, she was working in a soup kitchen for striking families and their children. She was very struck by the poverty of the children that she was serving, and also the ways in which their conventional schooling, to the extent that they had access to it, was really not serving them. And thinking back to her own roots as a former Sunday school teacher, she really thought that the way forward for the labor movement was to reach this younger generation. And so she decided to start a Sunday school that would not teach Christian values, but would rather teach leftist values. Things like, what is a strike? Why don't we break strikes? What is the relationship between workers and bosses? What is alienation? How are we being alienated from our labor as workers? These sorts of things. And they often drew from traditions of Christian Sunday schools. So they might have a hymnal, but it would be books of, union songs. Or a lot of them had 10 commandments, but they would be something like, be courteous to all men, but bow down to none. Or do not be revengeful, but stand up for your right and resist oppression. These sorts of things. So it was sort of borrowing the form of, more familiar Sunday schools, but using it in a secular fashion with specifically the goal of putting, moving forward the labor movement by teaching the, younger generations how, what their rights were, what they deserved in this world, and how to create a better world for themselves and for the future.
Now, I don't want you to think this is a positive, right? Because this is a negative. But they took the Christ out of Sunday school. So this gets my next question of the woman who started this was kind of turned off by religion, and they're just keeping the form, but getting rid of the heart, dare I say, of Christianity. And so are they connected at all to Christian socialism, which I always think is kind of an oxymoron, because we all know that Jesus was a capitalist. That's why he kicked the moneylenders out of the temple. They were cutting in on his market. So was there elements of Christianity at all, or were they just Sunday school just means, 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning? Is that all that it meant to these socialist Sunday schools?
Sure. So I think that you can draw connections between the socialist Sunday school movement and contemporary movements to unite Christianity and socialism. So around the same time, and also in Great Britain, there was a movement called the Labour Church, which is sort of, as you were alluding to, this blend of Christianity and leftism, as its name suggests, pro-labor. So while these schools themselves were not Christian in character, were not religious in character, I think they sort of speak to a broader trend, or are part of a broader trend in which socialists, Christian socialism, and religious socialism, we can also see Jewish socialism, et cetera, played a role.
Now, to me, a labor church actually sounds really good, because a lot of times when I'm at church and I'm like, I wish I could just pull out my laptop and get some work done here, but that feels rude.
Right. Well, but so let's drill down to the timing a little bit. This was like 1910 when the Socialist Sunday School was first founded?
So the very first was, I believe, in 1892.
Oh, okay.
In England, but they spread to the United States a little bit later, so early 20th century. So, early 20th century was really their heyday, and they started, declining towards the middle of the century.
Gotcha. And, that period does overlap with something called the modern school movement. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it was not inspired by socialism or Marxism, but by the anarchist pedagogy of Francisco Ferrer. But did you find any kind of interaction between the modern school movement and this, socialist Sunday school movement in your research, especially considering the fraught relationship between Marxism and anarchism at the time?
That's a good question. I couldn't find anything explicitly, but it's certainly something interesting to look into, because I think you're absolutely right to say that the socialist Sunday school movement was not the only game in town in terms of, rethinking pedagogy and specifically thinking about how to inculcate leftist values into the youth. So that's certainly something that I'd be interested in looking into further.
I mean, I got to say, I'm not super well versed in a lot of this leftist thought, but I will say, to me, the social Sunday schools themselves sound very anarchist. So in your article, you write, in a 1910 newspaper article, social Sunday school teacher Kenneth Thompson wrote that the children select their own officers. Students were able to create and enforce their own rules, even overruling the proposals of teachers and administrators, which is bad enough. But you also write of an account in Rochester, New York, where the students could elect whether or not they wanted to take the test. Now, why did the school administrators allow this kind of anarchy to persist and not just, stand up and say, hey, enough, cut it out?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the most striking facets of these schools. It's not merely the content of their education, but specifically the sort of social milieu that they created, or the power structures that they created and sort of deconstructed. So as you alluded to, there were sort of numerous instances of these schools that operated under a model whereby the students were invested with a lot more power than they would have, at schools at that time, and also today, right? Even today we think we have so much more enlightened values, but I would be hard pressed to think of an instance in my own schooling in U.S. public schools where we would have these sorts of options that you laid out. And I think it sort of speaks to a broader mission of these schools to teach children to question power structures, right? A lot of the criticism that they faced at the time was that they were indoctrinating students. But I think what this sort of power structure, this alternate power structure whereby children were given a lot of power, speaks to is that, rather than telling students what to do and what to think, they're giving children the tools to think for themselves, both to question the learning that they are receiving from their teachers during their Monday through Friday schools, as well as, teaching them to think, well, why does this person have power over me? And how would it be if instead we distributed power more equally? So in this way, on a small scale, they were being asked to not merely imagine a more utopian future, but to, as people on the left say, to prefigure the utopian future to come.
Yeah, and they also had a number of cute little monikers for the students at these Sunday schools. I just want to mention Young Revolutionists. I like that one. Good Little Rebels, I think, is even better. And my favorite one is Little Comrades, honestly. But I do wonder, when did these socialist Sunday schools disappear? And have there been any attempts to revive that tradition for the Little Comrades since?
Sure. So in England, one of the big obstacles that these schools faced was that a lot of the spaces that they were operating in were owned by councils, which, basically sort of local governments. Mm-hmm. And I think for reasons that are easy to imagine, these local governments, which might be more conservative in nature, tended to look quite askance at, groups of children being taught to, go on general strike and, revolt against the powers that be. And so they started really clamping down on who could use their spaces and basically trying to drive out these schools, which were, not super well funded. It's not as though they were getting, grants from, huge funders to do this. They were, really sort of ad hoc creations. And so this was really one huge obstacle that led to the decline of these schools in the UK. Another being sort of splits in the Labour Party that led to sort of more general disunion in the labor movement in the UK, and then also the world wars, right, which would have been enormously disruptive. In the US, I haven't been able to find a huge amount of scholarship, except to suggest that, as one can imagine, the rise of the Red Scare really did contribute to a lot of pressure on these schools to disband. And indeed, in reading sort of editorials by campaigners against these schools, sort of conservative or centrist voices who really wanted these schools to shut down, they were really calling for almost extra legal methods to be taken in order to suppress the teachers, saying that the teachers should be locked up, despite the fact that, there's no crime that you can point to that they committed. I think the fact that these schools were preaching internationalism and pacifism at a time of increasing militancy would also have brought them, within the sights of the law. And so I think their downfall was really the fact that they were preaching these radical ideas at a time of increasing conservatism. But as to the second part of your question, whether there has been a movement to bring these schools back, I found one instance of a sort of DSA, local group starting a new socialist Sunday school along these lines in the New York area. As for a broader movement to bring them back, I'm not sure that one exists, but certainly one of the goals of writing this article was to hopefully get that sort of conversation going, because I think that many of the topics that these schools were discussing are unfortunately still relevant, as well as, many of the things that these schools were reacting to, right? So they were really being founded at a time when Taylorism or scientific management was really coming into vogue in factories, but also these ideas that people are economic machines and they should be as efficient as possible. This idea was also coming into the classroom sort of for the first time at that time. And I think that these ideas are unfortunately still very much in vogue. You can think of the degree to which STEM is focused upon in American classrooms today, to the exclusion of the arts, for instance, which are thought of as frivolous, as not useful. And so I think that for this reason, it really behooves us to think about how we can, both how we can radically reimagine conventional schooling, but also up until that happens, how we might think of alternate or parallel systems of education to operate at the same time.
But don't we want to be teaching our children ways to succeed in the world the way that it currently is? We can't really monitor in your job day to day, how much you can think critically. Instead, we can monitor and collect data over your use on a computer and things like that, and teach kids how to hit designated KPIs when they enter the workforce.
So I guess I would say to that is just because something is not measurable or not easily measurable does not mean that it does not have worth. So I think you're probably correct in saying that certain things are more easily quantified, but I don't think that you can conclude from that that they are more valuable. I
think they are more valuable. I think also the correct answer is just all hail Taylorism.
Okay. Well, as to the sort of other part of your question, why don't we want to teach these children this? It is because, quite simply, if you have a competitive system where everybody has to compete with each other, then there are going to be a lot of people who cannot come out on top. That's how competition works, right? Not everybody wins in a competition. And these are people who are going to, suffer. If you cannot provide for your family, you're going to suffer. If you cannot afford medical care or, proper housing, you are going to suffer. And so rather than saying, well, that's okay, I accept this because some people will succeed at the expense of these other people, I think what we need to do is to radically reimagine society such that, we don't have winners and losers, but rather that we recognize that all people deserve a dignified life, a life that is not marked by material wants, and that is also, marked by joy and pleasure and beauty. And to me, really the only way to achieve this is through leftism. And I would also just say that this is something that takes on increasing urgency given climate change, the need to rethink society so that we are not constantly producing and competing and buying and selling, but rather thinking through what a sustainable, equitable society looks like, such that we do not continue to destroy our planet.
Well, I got to say, Erica, that I do think there's always going to be losers, namely my ex-wife's new man, Ted.
But I'm going to say myself.
No,
Namely
not myself. No, I'm a winner. But here's the thing also. Here's what I think we should do. We should also introduce maybe in like, not just an idea of like winners and losers and some people are not going to come out on top. Then that's where you have to introduce a sense of shame and make people feel ashamed for being at the bottom so then they work harder so that then they too can be on top. Well, let me tell you also here's how I would do it, because you said in the article that there was no national curriculum or collection of standards to be enforced. So what I would do is I would sign up to be one of these socialist Sunday school teachers, right? And then I would go in there and I would say, guess what, kids? America is the greatest country in the world. We're not racist. Capitalism rules. Communism drools. I'm a socialist teacher. And they can't kick me out, right? There's no national standard. I'm not really breaking any rules.
Okay, so you would subvert the system for your own purposes. Well, it seems that you would be easily able to teach these sorts of values in conventional schooling, right? After all,
well, I'm busy during the week, so Sundays work best.
You're busy during the week, I see. So it's more convenient for you on a Sunday. But I think if people are really so concerned about these schools as loci of indoctrination, they should take heart in the fact that the Monday through Friday schools are certainly doing their bit to teach capitalist values and teach values of competition and precisely what you were describing. And it's my hope that these sorts of alternative methods of schooling would allow students to ask questions of what they're being taught, to ask questions of where their textbook comes from, who created it, why they're learning this or that, why they might feel ashamed or why they're being told to feel ashamed, as you mentioned, because they are poor, they can't find work, or this, that, and the other. And rather than saying that it's a fault within themselves that's either it's intractable or that must only be solved by self-improvement, seeing that there are much larger systems at work that can be gotten at, that can be fixed and changed through collective labor, but not through individual labor.
Right. And Erica, I like this idea a lot. The more I hear it, I may be a Joe Lieberman liberal, but I think we need more political Sunday schools. But why do you think that liberals like me never engage with ideas like this? Why don't they start a school to inculcate children with the knowledge that Bernie Sanders isn't a Democrat, Ralph Nader caused 9/11, and RBG made the right call by not retiring under Barack Obama?
It's a good question. I think one strain of thought that is common amongst a lot of liberals is this idea that there is sort of a neutral education, that one must present both sides and this sort of thing. And I think it's perhaps for this reason that people maybe are not aware of the degree to which conventional schooling is itself highly politicized, right? So if you strive for this neutrality, this perfect zero position from which you hope that people will arrive at a liberal viewpoint such as yours, I think you don't have an incentive to create a parallel system. I would also say that to the extent that liberals benefit from and are take part in the creation of mainstream political thought and broader power structures, they don't need to resort to alternate means of education, because they are at the table, so to speak, when it comes to creating how we are taught in conventional schools. And it's precisely because leftists question this power on a radical level that they are both excluded in their points of view, and that they they must resort to sort of grassroots methods of creating these alternate forms of education.
Right. But you do have things like the 1619 project, which I believe has a curriculum that is in school this year. So that's working within the system. So how might that be different? Because it does seem to echo something of what the Socialist Sunday schools were trying to do, trying to make kids think a little bit more critically about the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't wish to suggest that there's nothing within the conventional educational system that contributes to critical thinking. All right, you point to the 1619 project, and I'm sure that on an individual level, many of us can point to a couple of great teachers that we had in our public schooling who did this job quite well. Made us question things. But I think on a broader level, conventional schools are incentivized to teach to standards, right? Teach to exams, for instance, to teach children to be disciplined in their bodies as a means of preparing them for being disciplined workers, right? Sit still for an hour, be quiet when you're told to be quiet, listen to your superiors, this, that, and the other. And so for this reason, I think that changing the curriculum is not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And what I really appreciate about the efforts of these early reformers of the Socialist Sunday schools is that they also questioned, this very idea of who should have power in a school and how should we teach children to be, as they called them, young revolutionaries, right? Not just children who are learning, a slightly more liberal take, but children who are really equipped to stand up and, strike or, really fight the powers that be.
But it seems easy to find children that are like ready to be like, oh, I could just say, I don't want to do this. I'll stand up and I don't want to do this. But I want to know, did you find in your research any examples of children doing the opposite of like, oh, actually, this economy thing sounds great. I want to grow up and be a day trader. Did you find any examples of like any right-wing Sunday school movements trying to instill, good conservative values and not just
wouldn't that just be normal Sunday school, Ralph?
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Well, kids need to know that abortion is bad, and I think Sunday school is a good place to bring it up as any.
Well, as a direct reaction to these schools, I didn't find anything. However, I think conventional Sunday schools, Christian Sunday schools, often do teach these conservative values. And I think it's also worth pointing out that particularly in the run-up to World War II, there were a number of fascist summer camps for, children who whose families, sympathized with Hitler, for example. And so there are such examples if you want to point to them in history.
Yeah, I think some of Ralph's ancestors went to those camps.
Well, I just want to point out, politics aside, I'm sure that the uniforms were nicer. I'm sure they had nice, clean uniforms, and I'm sure that the Socialist Sunday schools probably had holes in their clothes, right?
Hey, now come on.
I'm sure that Hugo Boss didn't design the Socialist Sunday schools.
I'm just saying, the Red Army had some good uniforms too. So,
well, actually, this brings up my next point, which is, what if we took this further? Now, I'm not, well versed again on a lot of these things, but Socialist summer camp, I want to start a communist summer camp where maybe or Sunday school, where I have kids stand in the bread line, but also what I would like to have is a mini gulag where I let them farm for free all summer, where, they get the experience of labor and really feeling, what it is to be, a part of a real labor movement where you're causing, real change, with our agriculture. And then what I do is then I take all of the things they farm, all the produce, and then I sell it to make sure that I have the most profitable.
So you're a feudal lord? Is that what this...
It's a communist summer camp.
Well, Well, that's a really interesting idea, given the fact that agriculture is sort of a loophole in child labor laws in the United States. I think there are many children in this country, unfortunately, who are already experiencing quite similar circumstances to precisely what you're describing.
Well, I hope it's fun for them.
Checkmate.
Well, because also I was looking up a little bit about this. Are the socialist Sunday schools connected with the rise of like Jewish socialist summer camps in the 50s and 60s that was popping up in places like the Catskills? Is there a historical connection between the two?
That's a good question. So my understanding, the sort of Jewish summer camp movement slightly postdates the heyday of these schools. But it's certainly true that while they were active, Jewish immigrants to the United States, and indeed, a number of immigrant communities took an active part. So, a lot of these schools were actually taught not in English, but in other languages, be it Yiddish, be it German, be it Finnish, what have you, because so many immigrants were part of the working class and were specifically part of, the radical left. So I can't really speak to a direct genetic connection there, except to say that it would certainly make sense, and I definitely see a kindred sort of animating spirit between the two.
Yeah.
Right, they're kind of pushing the same sort of like leftist values.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your article, this reminds me that you mentioned there might have been even more socialist Sunday schools if you count, non-English language Sunday schools. I know German was a very, prominent language in the U.S. at that time. But am I right that the records with those non-English Sunday schools are hard to come by?
Yeah, it seems that the scholarship on these schools primarily focuses on English medium schools. I think in part because of, maybe the languages that the historians working on this subject speak. But it's certainly true that there were a number of these schools that were not English language medium. And so I think that that's sort of another important sort of area of research. Absolutely.
So they're teaching kids, sorry, just to go back a little bit, I want to go into a story that you tell at the beginning of your article that, the main goal of these Sunday schools is to get kids to just start questioning things and start thinking more free. And I was shocked that, okay, you want to get kids to think for themselves and start questioning things of like, why am I being served a juice cup? I could throw this on the floor and demand a soda, whatever. But these kids started to question things that I think are beyond what any kid should be questioning, and that was Santa Claus. And now you open with a story about Santa doing something that I found very reprehensible because I think that he's like one of the ultimate capitalists. But he goes on strike. Well, because he gives rich kids better presents than the poor kids. He's an even playing field. But so tell us a story about when you open the article about the Santa story.
Sure. So the anecdote that I open with is a story of a school play that's put on at one of these schools, and it's a story that the children wrote themselves. So they wrote this play in which Santa Claus decides to go on strike, and he says that he will only come back if the children decide to vote socialist and support strikes and support their parents who are laborers, just as Santa and his elves are laborers. So it was sort of a way in which the children took this familiar tale of Santa Claus and put sort of labor spin on it, promoting values of striking and solidarity and sort of brotherhood amongst workers, as well as support for the Socialist Party.
Right. I think that sounds like something maybe Joe Biden should look into. Like, kids, I'm sorry, if you don't get your parents to vote for me, Santa ain't coming this year.
That's certainly an unexplored angle that the Democrats might consider.
I mean, I also assume that the kids probably stopped their play before Act 3, where Santa just becomes Stalin and he kills all the people who don't agree that Christmas is real and everything, you know? And forces all the kids to make their own toys.
This is before Stalin, just to be clear.
What?
This is like 40 years before
I'm just saying, but if they carried the idea further, they would get there. The kids would figure it out. I think they were smart kids.
I don't know if prophecy was taught in these schools, but it's possible.
Well, one thing that I find really fascinating about this period, the late 19th, early 20th century period, was that it was a moment when community and human fellowship seemed to be at its zenith, particularly among the left. You know, there were socialist Sunday schools, but there's also socialist adult summer camps, socialist sports teams, and so on. But I do wonder if it's really possible to revive something like the socialist Sunday school movement today, considering how disconnected the average person is from their real world community, not to mention their local church. So how can would-be socialist Sunday schoolers combat digital alienation, or do you think it's possible to do something like this in our modern era?
It's a good question. I think it certainly is possible, but of course there are obstacles, as indeed there were at the time, right? So a lot of these Sunday school teachers at the time would have been, devoting a lot of unpaid hours devising curricula, this, that, and the other. And so it is quite a burden upon people who are already, working quite long hours. And, this challenge is something that would remain constant today, particularly given, the precarity of so much work today. So I think it is something that calls for, that needs a strong sense of community, and perhaps instead of having one devoted teacher who has to, work every Sunday, it might be a question of switching off. But I would also say that, since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been very heartened by seeing, so many mutual aid projects coming up. I mean, the fact that the New York Times even deigns to mention the word mutual aid, they wrote an article about it. It sort of gives me hope that rather than being a time marked by increasing separation and alienation, you're seeing people really doing battle with precisely this idea and trying to come together despite these obstacles. So I completely recognize the points that you're making regarding the challenges, but I would say that I'm optimistic, particularly given the growth of mutual aid, the growth of groups like DSA, the fact that since the uprisings this summer, people are becoming more interested in radical Black history, and you can think of the Black Panthers as also having this sort of radical educational components. Their free lunch or free breakfast program, for instance, sort of dovetails into what I'm talking about. So I'm optimistic.
So giving kids free lunch with a side of Marxism, and they're like, "Oh, this is great. This tastes like Jell-O," and they don't even know that they're being indoctrinated.
Again, I think rather than indoctrination, I would say that they're being taught to question. They're being taught to consider the way the world is and why, and think that there might be an alternative. But yes, they are getting free Jell-O.
I just feel sorry for their future bosses who ask them to do something on an Excel sheet, and they'll say, "But why, sir? Why?" It's going to be very frustrating.
Because they know about the surplus value of labor?
Yeah, no one should know about the surplus value of labor. And also, this does remind me of the thing you're talking about with COVID happening now, people feeling more connected in community and mutual aid. This is more reason why we need a vaccine, and we need it now. So people get back to work. We can end this pandemic nonsense and get the economy working again. The longer people feel disconnected and, the longer they need this community, the faster communism will rise and Antifa will take over.
Well,
Sorry to throw a
if
little
you can
quick rant in there.
if you can convince your fellow right-wingers to drop their anti-vax position, I think I think you have sort of an uphill battle there.
Well, if you can convince Bill Gates not to put a microchip in my hand, then yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah, but that does raise an interesting, point, because I guess with COVID, in some ways, like this kind of digital alienation I was talking about has receded a little bit, because all you need to do to interact with others, for a lot of people, especially people who work in white collar jobs like me and Ralph, all you have to do is get on a Zoom call, right? So maybe there could be some kind of digital socialist Sunday school or something like that.
Absolutely. I was working on another article about the sort of revival of endangered languages, particularly native languages in the United States under COVID. And clearly these languages are particularly under threat because their native speakers happen to be older, hence the most vulnerable population should they get sick. And I was speaking to some teachers of Native American language called Ichishkin, and what they were saying was that in many ways, actually bringing it to Zoom rather than to a conventional classroom has brought some life back to the language, because it was a language that was spoken at home, amongst families in real communities, and whereas in a classroom there's something sort of artificial about it, and then actually, because people were at home, and you could see the background, you could talk about people's, real life. You could say, what are you cooking? Well, how do we say that in our language? How do we describe, our traditional foods, this sort of thing. So I think there's something to be said about the sense of home that this sort of creates, if you permit it, right? I mean, you could easily just put up, a Zoom background and no one could see, or you could sort of invite people into your home and sort of be much more open in that respect. And I think that sort of opens up, greater possibilities in terms of thinking about, do we really want to enforce a strict division between life and education, or do we want to say that this is all one thing? And, maybe start to unify them in a more intentional and meaningful way.
Well, this also gets to, I believe, when you were talking about in 2016, how the DSA in New York tried to revive the Socialist Sunday School model, but I believe it's also for adults, correct?
Yeah, so, and I would also say that in the early 20th century, adults did indeed participate in these schools. So the majority of students would have been children, but adults would have been present as well, which I think is really wonderful, because we often think of education as sort of a closed portion of our lives. You do it between this age and that age, and then it's work. But if we could consider ways in which we can think of education as a continuing process and also a joyful process, I think it would just, bring so much more color into our lives, and also, allow us to create, bonds between generations, allow us to think about how we can, learn from each other in non-hierarchical ways, and these sorts of things. So this is again, one thing I really appreciate about this movement is its, cross-generational efforts.
So you think we should learn from each other and not live in fear of each other and not demonize others?
Precisely.
Well, all I can say is that I stopped learning at the age of 13 when I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I said, well, that's enough for me. So we want to thank you again for coming on the show, Erica. To our listeners, go check out our article on current affairs called The Past and Future of the Socialist Sunday School. Now, before you go, Erica, where can our listeners learn more about you and your work?
Sure. So they can go to my website, which is ericaxeisen.com. Or they can go to hypocritesreader.com, which is a magazine that I help to edit of leftist essays and political thought.
So you hear that, cowards? Be good little comrades and go check that out.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for coming on. And is there anything you mentioned that you were working on an article about Indigenous languages? When is that coming out? Do you have an idea?
So I'm hoping to do a series. I've just had one out at Slate recently, and sort of other parts of the series I'm not quite sure yet. But I'm also working on another piece for Current Affairs, which should come out soon on the commodification of clean air. So if readers are interested, they can check that out.
Sounds very interesting. Well, we hope to have you on again sometime soon, and thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the invitation.